Perfect. Good afternoon, everyone. Good evening. Those of you who may find yourselves across the globe. And good morning for many of you who are in uh, the West Coast. I know we have several more people who um, are going to join us. So I'm going to slowly begin our time today together. And I just want to welcome you. You know, it's a really fascinating and tough time to be alive. So it's just a precious thing to be able to just connect at least via Zoom in this format. So it is with just incredible gratitude um, and a feeling of being blessed that I'm here with you today to just share some perspective around contemplative science and what does it mean to engage in that from a healing centered perspective. Today, I will talk to you just for about 10 minutes and really just so you can see me and connect with me. And then I will share my PowerPoint and I will guide you through some slides that really go through some research that I have done and kind of walk through some really important things to keep in mind as we are diving into this work. I want to invite us, before we begin, just to kind of settle into our chairs. Let's take a moment to just ground ourselves. And wherever you are, just take a moment just to feel your body. Take a moment to just settle into the space. Take a moment to just ground yourself, feeling your feet on the ground. Feeling that beautiful earth just always there for us, supporting us, pressing up against our feet. Feeling that chair. Bringing your attention to the tip of your nose and just gently inhaling and exhaling. In whatever way that feels most comfortable, just to ground yourself in this present moment. Using this opportunity to just check in with yourself. We carry so much tension and stress in our shoulders. On your next exhale, just gently letting your shoulders drop. And just if you close your eyes, just gently opening them back up. Just kind of feeling our bodies, you know. And that's one of the biggest contributions to this current moment in regards to contemplative science and many of the healing arts like yoga, is the return to the body, the reconnection to the body. So allow me to just frame a couple things to really lay down a foundation for this work. I just finished my doctoral education at Columbia Teachers College, and so I'm still celebrating. I had a Zoom graduation, and I come from Dominican Republic, and any of you who know Dominicans, you know, Zoom graduation doesn't do it. So I'm still celebrating. And so the work that I'm going to share with you comes out of that incredible 5-year period of intense study and intense practice throughout the country. And then also 10 years of just being in the field of education. I want to begin by acknowledging the multiple levels of crises we are undergoing the public health crisis of the pandemic, and us trying to deal and cope with and adapt to responding to COVID-19. I send the energy to all of you right now as you cope with that, and as we feel the fragility that comes with understanding that this moment puts all of us in a vulnerable position. And then also the interconnectedness that this moment reveals, as far as how this global planet, this planet of ours, is so interconnected, but where such a virus can spread so fast. I also want to acknowledge the fact that we have another pandemic, that pandemic of racialized hierarchies and racism and structural inequality that becomes very vivid right now in the face of police brutality and the ways in which our society has been structured to distribute resources unequitably, especially of those of us who have a darker hue. So I just want to acknowledge what we are all facing right now, and the economics, the vulnerable economic piece of all of this. Many of us are working harder than ever before. Many of us are out of work. Many of us are essential workers and are working in incredible vulnerable positions. Lastly, I want to acknowledge the passing of all those precious human beings who have lost their lives at the hands of police. Breonna Taylor, Elijah McClain, George Floyd, Tony McDade, Ahmaud Arbery, and so many more, and so many more. And this talk is dedicated to them and dedicated to the public outcry that is still strong, declaring that Black lives do matter. With that being said, welcome. So we're going to be exploring contemplative science and in the context of a healing-centered perspective today. I want to say that there are two separate things here. One is contemplative science. In contemplative science, we want to acknowledge the Mind and Life Institute. We want to acknowledge the Dalai Lama. We want to acknowledge Arthur Seance. We want to acknowledge Francisco Varela. We want to acknowledge Richie Davies. We want to acknowledge Daniel Siegel. We want to acknowledge so many scientists, physicists, neuroscientists who over the last 2 to 3 decades have laid the groundwork for studying the inner world of our minds, but specifically connected to the impact of meditation and the impact of contemplative practices. So on the one hand, contemplative science is the systematic investigation through disciplined inquiry of the impact of meditation, the impact of contemplative practices on the mind and on behavior. And what we know from all that research, beautiful contemplative scientific research, is that meditation and contemplative practice have a physiological effect on the body, have a very visible neurological manifestation in terms of the ways that it maybe even creates neural pathways in the brain. So we've been able to document how extensive contemplative practice or extensive meditation can increase a sense of well-being, can even increase a sense of gratitude, can increase a level of focus and even productivity at times. So acknowledging the incredible research that has been done in that field to document the power of some of these practices to shift our behavior, to shift our habits, and to shift our mindsets. So on the one hand, there's contemplative science. And then that science growing, right? So now a lot of that science is shifting towards how do we use contemplative science to develop other kinds of behaviors, like pro-social behavior. And I'll talk a little bit about that later. But things like forgiveness, things like compassion, things like collaboration, things like teamwork. So all of a sudden, we are seeing studies and programs, and the Mind and Life Institute is a leader in this, And the Center for Contemplative Mind, C-Mind, has been a leader in this field as well, of looking at how do we channel and harness the power of mindfulness and contemplative practice for the development of compassion, the development of just kind of almost a heartfulness. So we have contemplative science. Now, another piece that's important to think about is the use of contemplative practice to do social science. Okay? The use of contemplative practices to do social science, which I would argue is part of a new wave of thinking, which I would even suggest is part of social science. And that's where I want to kind of really talk to you about today. And it is with utter humility that I be
Hi, everybody. It seems like we have just run into some connection issues. So I am going to try to get a hold of Angel and get him back on. Please stay tuned and thank you. Oh.
the classic Zoomiverse. My apologies.
Okay.
The classic Zoomiverse. You know. So my apologies if we should be all set now. So my apologies for the Wi-Fi there. The fragility is very vivid these days with our Wi-Fi connections. So I want to acknowledge the Mind and Life Institute and their recent Summer Research Institute. Definitely look out for their Summer Research Institutes in the future and many of their other offerings. If you look at this title, Cultivating Pro-Social Development Across Lifespan, Context, Relationships, and Contemplative Practices. What I want you to acknowledge is that a lot of contemplative science is moving towards thinking about developing these pro-social skills. And again, pro-social skills involving kind of being trustworthy, having the ability to engage in forgiveness, compassion, and many other skills that would consider soft skills. So I want to show you this because there's a big shift happening in the academy, and I want to kind of be able to trace it for you. I also want to acknowledge this was a conference that was hosted by the Center for Contemplative Mind by C-Mind several years ago. I was actually the co-chair of this conference, and it was a very powerful conference, and it really came at a juncture for the organization. The organization was really thinking about deepening its commitment to social justice, but it also came at a point where the field, in terms of the mindfulness movement and the contemplative education movement, were wrestling with this idea that, on the one hand, contemplative practices and mindfulness are great for increasing our well-being and allowing us to develop a sense of self-awareness, but in many cases, they were divorced from dealing with and transforming the very structures that cause suffering in the first place. So I want to put this down as a very important moment in C-Mind history, but also in the larger movement of trying to radicalize contemplative education, trying to use contemplative science, contemplative practice for an aim beyond just well-being, but actually structural change and justice. So it is with that kind of integration that we step into this conversation of using the power of mindfulness and contemplative practice to actually change the structures that cause the healing in the first place. Because if we use mindfulness and contemplative practice just to be Zen, just to be kind of have an overall sense of well-being, then we'll be in a repetitive pattern of trying to escape the very structures that produce the suffering in the first place. I want to acknowledge that I am not the only one having this conversation. There are many others who are wrestling with notions of justice, notions of racial justice, notions of social justice, and the intersection of oppression and contemplative practice. Sister Beth Barilla, wonderful colleague. I know she has an offering coming up soon. Sister Reverend Angel, my sensei, wonderful work with Radical Dharma. Sister Rhonda McGee with her recent book on the inner work of racial justice. Sister Mirabai's book, Contemplative Practices in Higher Education. Senti Pensante by Laura Rendon. And of course, my brother Stephen Shigematsu with his recent text on heartfulness. There's a bubble. There's a kind of there's a point now where so many of us are saying the same thing in different ways. So it's a beautiful moment. I want to acknowledge and go into contemplative science and contemplative social science. And one of the leading figures for me is Valerie Yanisek. She wrote this beautiful text a couple years ago called Contemplative Qualitative Inquiry. So for those of you who are researchers out there, very beautiful text outlining how to use meditation and contemplative practice, not just to reduce stress, not just to increase well-being, but actually to carry out research. Very powerful. And that's the central thing that I want to talk to you about today. I also want to slow down a bit. Many of us are in higher education institutions, and the push in the academy right now is obviously to wrestle with when do we reopen, and obviously continue to produce research, continue to get funding, and the citation politics that come with that. You want to acknowledge that a few years ago, a group of feminist scholars began a movement called slow scholarship, slow scholarship, which was an invitation to slow down the pace of thinking, the pace of production of scholarship, the pace of the ways in which the academy was looking like a neoliberal institution that was just focused on profit, and a return to older values of actual enjoyment in the pursuit of wisdom, in the supporting of younger scholars, because the pressures of a neoliberal economic order was almost kind of thwarting the efforts of producing good scholarship. So contemplative science and contemplative social science, I would argue, is in the tradition of slowing down, slow scholarship. And I have been in that particular movement, and I'll show you some of the ways that I've been engaging in some of that slow scholarship. I want to acknowledge that this work is within what, some scholars, including myself, call a restorative and healing-centered paradigm. A restorative and healing-centered paradigm. And what this means is that over the last 100 years or so, there's enough evidence that points to different historical and social forces inviting us to engage in more restorative practices. For example, contemplative science and mindfulness, the mindfulness movement, right? Looking at the power of the brain and the power of contemplative practice and the ability to increase well-being by way of yogic and other healing arts-based practices, right? That is quantitatively documented. And leaders like John Kabat-Zinn and many others with mindfulness-based stress reduction and the many other types of practices have been very clear that this stuff works and it's powerful. So that is one kind of stream, one braid in this particular movement. The second one is the social emotional learning. Social emotional learning, and coming out of Daniel Goleman's work in the 90s in social intelligence and emotional intelligence, and Howard Gardner's work of expanding this notion of intelligence, not just IQ, but also EQ, SQ, emotional intelligence, social intelligence, musical intelligence, visual intelligence, sonic intelligence, exploding this notion of intelligence, allowing for more access and entry points for different people. So social emotional learning and tapping into this ability to understand emotions and articulate them is part of this move to kind of add some kind of a holistic approach to education. And within that kind of braid, you have trauma-informed practices and trauma-informed teaching. And the book, mindfulness and trauma-informed mindfulness by that colleague of ours that's given a webinar over here before. So this interest in care, this interest in trauma-informed practices, this interest in making sure we have the skills to articulate our emotions and explore difficult ones is part of this kind of this incredible movement in the field. Another piece is restorative justice. Restorative justice comes out of the 20th century and many scholars in the criminal justice system trying to find a different way of engaging in punishment. We know that our country is one of the world's leading in-prisoners. We have, in the United States right now, we have 25% of the world's prisoners. Listen to that. 25% of the world's prisoners are in the United States. It costs about $100,000 to house and feed one inmate a year. We spend so much money on the carceral state. So that restorative practices are part of a movement to create more restorative approaches to punishment, especially in schools. So instead of suspending kids, instead of engaging in overly punitive practices, detention, you end up having restorative circles, restorative conferences that don't exile the student from the community, but actually bring them closer into the community, having all kinds of processes to alleviate the situation. But we know that many of our babies who end up punished are predominantly children of color. And those babies end up, and there's a direct connection between the prison industrial complex and the punitive practices in schools. But let me calm down a little bit. Let me slow down. Because the last kind of pattern is this reality that we're living in a finite planet. And we know that climate change is real. So one last kind of braid in this kind of paradigm is the reality that we are now forced to find equilibrium with this earth, to be in right relationship with the planet. So this restorative and healing centered paradigm comes to us by the selective pressure of the current moment of serious scholarship, and then also the realities that we need to treat our Mother Earth very differently. So with that being said, I'm going to share a little bit of my own scholarship and how I engaged in contemplative social science through a healing-centered perspective, and how I carried out my own version of slow scholarship. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to share with you basically my dissertation defense and some of the quick snippets from my doctoral research. My doctoral research was titled In Pursuit of Healing-Centered Education, a case study of racial literacy and healing professional development workshop series. And I basically spent extensive time looking at what healing-centered education meant, and especially in the context of thinking about race and racism. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just kind of lay out a little bit of the purpose of my research, the questions, the conceptual framework that came out, the methodology, the literature review, findings, implications, limitations, just to give you a really strong example of what rigorous social contemplative science looks like. So I met with a group of educators from the Department of Education in New York City for about 6 months. Once a month, they were going through this program that was teaching them and educating them on racial literacy, especially racial literacy in the context of healing. And in that program, they meditated, they did all kinds of different things, and also think about race and racism. And the questions that I was asking with my research were how did the educator design the curriculum? Especially how did she conceptualize it as a healing-centered professional development? How was the healing-centered curriculum implemented and enacted? And how did participants process the impact of the experience? So those were the kind of general questions to the research. And I want to say that I ended up taking contemplative inquiry, but also in taking different theoretical frameworks and combining them together. So for example, I drew on indigenous practices and indigenous research methodologies, the indigenous stance, meaning I looked at indigenous knowledge and indigenous ways of being, and I incorporated it into my study, into protocol, into contemplative qualitative inquiry. And I made sure that I was accountable to the relationships in the field, that there was transparency between participants and I, that there was a sense of relationality, meaning I wasn't just doing research on them, I was doing research with them. There was a kind of a bi-directional flow of knowledge. I was learning as much from them as they were learning from me. I was changing as much as the participants were changing. I also incorporated a healing-centered engagement, which is a conceptual framework that comes out of the healing-centered paradigm, that understands that healing is culturally grounded, that it supports people's restoration of who they are, and that it attends to the healing of the practitioner, or in this case, the teachers. And lastly, a transformative activist agenda, meaning a non-neutral stance to research. You see, many of us are in the academy and are pressed and pressured to be objective. And the illusion and the suggestion is that objectivism increases the validity of our research. That is true, especially with quantitative research. But when it comes to social science, the reality that we are objective is actually not true. We come with our biases. We are shaped by our previous experiences. So I stepped into the research actively knowing that I was interested in understanding change, understanding how I was going to change, how participants were going to change, and how the political and social forces that we were all embedded in contributed to a non-neutral space, and interested in equitable futures. So this was my theoretical framework. And in terms of my literature review, I recognized that in the literature, there were these beautiful strands of scholarship within indigenous scholarship and education, within higher education, within community organizing, within K through 12 schools and curricula. There were all kinds of pieces of evidence that pointed to this healing-centered paradigm, meaning teachers, researchers, educators, practitioners, asking what are the conditions necessary for people to thrive, for people to heal, and for people to show up to the classroom or to the community feeling like they are their full selves. Very powerful framing. So in terms of my research, the methodology that I used, I looked at 5 workshops across 5 months. I interviewed 18 people during 45 to 60-minute interviews. I did 5 90-minute focus groups. I did an intense document review of curriculum documents, of participant artifacts, up until the point that I achieved data saturation. And throughout that process, it was iterative. So I was constantly looking at my participant observation, my interviews, my focus groups, my contemplative inquiry and inquiry journal. And I did it iteratively, meaning I was constantly going back and looking at data again and again and again. So here's where I tell you a little bit about how I incorporated indigenous knowledge and contemplative social science. First, indigenous knowledge. If you read this quote, stories go in circles. They don't go in straight lines. It helps if you listen in circles because there are stories inside of stories, between stories, and finding your way through them is as easy and as hard as finding your way home. Part of finding is getting lost. And when you are lost, you start to open up and listen. This is a powerful insight from an indigenous elder. And some of the ways in which I listened to the data, in which I listened to the research participants, was in this almost spiral format, listening to patterns, listening to recurring themes, getting lost in the process, but doing it with a contemplative perspective. So for example, I engage in contemplative qualitative inquiry. So I use meditation and I use contemplative practices to actually sit with the data. So these are images of actual excerpts from interviews. The top picture is images they're text from interviews from my participants of quotes that stood out to me. The bottom right is even more granular sorting of different comments from participants. In the top left, you have codes, research codes that I created based on looking at the data. And I would literally sit in either a meditation bench or a meditation posture or just a chair. And I would set a timer and use contemplative practices about 15 minutes in different kind of intervals and sit with the data and just allow to go beyond the analysis. Just allow the contemplative practice to let me build a deeper relationship with the data, a deeper relationship with what was coming up throughout this research process. So using contemplative inquiry is a powerful way to actually engage in data analysis, not just meditation and contemplative practices, just to develop well-being and stress reduction. I even did a labyrinth walk. I would take flashcards and put different bits of data on the floor and create a labyrinth. And I would walk through the labyrinth in my house as if I was doing a contemplative walk, slow walk through the data. I would pick up a data point and look at it and read it in silence, sit with what was coming up, digest it, analyze it, take notes. And I would do this for specific periods of time. So here are my findings. After carrying out my research as a contemplative social science enterprise, I found 2 things. That what the instructor did and what the experience produced was a healing praxis. A healing praxis, meaning this 2-pronged approach, where on the one hand, participants were engaging in self-care, taking care of themselves, their souls, their bodies, their minds, and thinking about their wounds and their past and how those wounds and that past impact their teaching, impact how they show up for the kids, how they show up for their colleagues. At the same time, they were learning about racial literacy and understanding how to decipher and understand how race and racism unfolded at ideological, individual, and institutional and interpersonal levels. So think about this very robust healing praxis. So I saw this very vividly after spending months sitting with the data, contemplating on the data, this beautiful two-pronged praxis of self-care and healing and developing the racial literacy necessary to, on the one hand, understand racism, but also interrupt it. Some last kind of findings at a more granular level were the participants ended up actually potentiating their healing journeys, meaning they ended up actually continuing on to do self-healing work after the workshops, so that the workshops opened participants up to the need to heal more. There was a constant surfacing of racialized stress and talking about how, for example, a Black colleague would share how she couldn't talk about race or racism in her school, or how she felt ignored, or how she felt oppressed, and being able to have the space to talk about that racialized stress. So surfacing that stress. There was this articulation of gratitude and empathy because of the ways in which the very community that met 5 times across 5 months became a very powerful space for healing and community development. And lastly, y'all know that when we go deep in conversations, conflict happens. So even this beautiful workshop series that was meant to talk about healing and racial literacy exploded in conflict at moments. And I was able to see how they navigated conflict and held it. So this was some of the findings. I want to end here by saying that the research contributed to theory, to practice, and to policy on different levels. And I will kind of just in passing reference these, that on a theoretical level, the work looked at and found that we need to think about epistemic healing. What are the ways in which knowledge that has been historically dismissed, like indigenous knowledge or Black feminist theory, how can we incorporate those ways of knowing in order to increase our level of understanding towards healing? How do we develop healing social structures? How do we engage in healing-centered engagement and what some scholars call marunage, which is this notion of being in an institution, yet not of an institution. So rebelling and resisting within an institution. And we could talk a little bit more about that. But of course, the practice was the two-pronged approach to development of educators, the power of bearing witness to each other's stress. And in terms of policy, you know, we can talk a little bit about that during the question and answer section. I want to close by saying that a lot of this work now has transitioned for me as I turn and I acknowledge the limitations of my research. Being too close to the community, meaning I had a previous relationships to some of these people. My sampling size was small. The sequencing of the interviews may have been inconsistent, and the research design could have been improved and enhanced by having a more longitudinal perspective. But we know that every research has its limitations. And I want to end by saying that across the next month, we'll have public events that will bring people together to do breath work. We'll also have an offering of a training series contemplating 400 years of inequality, using contemplative practices to deal and to cope with and transcend some of the very dysfunctional past that is replete in our last 400 years. With that being said, I thank you for being with me today, sharing space with me, And you can definitely check out my website at drangelacosta.com. Sign up for our mailing list in the front page, because we'll be sending out resources and scholarship updates. So with that being said, it was a pleasure to just deliver that brief talk. I want to open the floor up. I wanted to initially have breakout groups, but I think it would be better to stay together in community, in circle. I want to invite you also to turn your cameras on if you'd like. This is going to be an opportunity to be in community, to be connected. So if you'd like to turn your video on, no pressure. But I want to acknowledge many of you who are here. Sister Hazer's here. Sister Linda Lantieri's here. Good to see you, sister. Her work is really beautiful around social emotional learning as well. So I want to end here. I am just a small speck in this beautiful constellation of scholars in this paradigm. So with that being said, I want to invite you to, you can raise your hand formally if you want to share a comment or share a question. You can also share a comment in the chat. So I want to open it up to you.
Thank you so much, Angel. I definitely felt your energy coming through. It did not feel like a traditional PowerPoint presentation, so thank you for sharing your work with us and your energy. It was electrifying. So as Angel said, if you would like to share something out to the group, a question or a comment, please use the raise hand function, which should be available in the participant menu. That will allow you to raise a little blue hand, and will help me find you in the list of participants so that I can unmute you.
And as you're deciding whether you want to participate or not, feel free to glance through the gallery of people just to acknowledge the beautiful faces that are in this space. And I'd love to hear a comment. I'd love to hear a question, any point of clarification. That was a lot to share. That was 2 hours of my doctoral defense in 20 minutes.
That was pretty impressive.
Let's have Kathy Maris and then Maria Tan. Kathy.
Yep.
Hi, thank you so much. That was just a wonderful session. Dr. Costa, I was wondering if you could talk about how you found your way to this process of doing research and approaching these questions.
Yeah. It was a very dynamic process, as you know. We all find our way in different ways. I initially had a meditation and a contemplative practice for many years, so that was there as a separate thing, whether it was yoga or whether it was sitting at different retreats. And then at the same time, I had always been interested in social justice education. So I've always facilitated many trainings around social justice and understanding how to think about structural inequality. So then I said, and I looked at the field and I saw that there was this incredible gap. People in the mindfulness movement were on one side doing incredible work of, helping us with reducing stress and increasing well-being. And yet on the other side, you had people in the social education space and social activist space burning out. And I was like, what's going on here? So I entered with a question. What is the connection between social justice education and mindfulness education? And through that, I noticed that there's been a long history. I mean, Thich Nhat Hanh with Engaged Buddhism is an incredible example of this integration of contemplative practice and direct action. And I learned so much more, and so many other people who are doing the work. And through that process, it was very clear to me that healing was necessary. So I ended up focusing on healing. So that's kind of a quick example of theoretically how I ended up here. And it took a lot of courage, especially at Columbia. I love Columbia. I love Teachers College. I love my advisor. But we know that some of these Ivy Leagues tend to tilt towards conservatism. So I could have easily studied college readiness or youth development and done something a little more sexy and that's more profitable. But I said, no, let's do this. And I think now that vision is now beginning to give fruit. Maria? Yeah, you'll mute yourself. Unmute. Oh yeah, unmute yourself. Yeah, we go.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Acosta.
Thank you.
I'm reading a lot in education right now about how the New York City Department of Education is really starting to prioritize like healing centered. Like I'm seeing it come up a lot now in what's being released. So as a teacher who is supported in bringing this to my school community, in a community that has never tried this before, where do we start?
Yeah. And, if we had more time, this is why my offer is that C-Mind host a longer engagement where we can actually build community around this. I have no problem leading that effort. But to you, Maria, it really has to start with you. Like you have to get grounded. You have to do your own work, because if we're going to invite others to do this kind of work, you got to be ready to support, and then also to deal with your own work around the healing. But I also want to say that just like mindfulness, public education systems throughout the country are now like struggling, and have been struggling for a while before COVID-19, to improve their pedagogies, right? So you saw this incredible turn towards mindfulness education. So mindfulness and education becomes a thing that now schools hire CBOs or consultants, and then, or SEL. Dr. Lantieri can talk about that all day, bringing in people in curriculum that help teachers teach students how to get in touch with their emotions. And so this moment now where the DOE in New York City in particular, and many others, are now going to say, okay, we're going to do healing-centered education, right? And extend their work around culturally responsive practices. The implementation may have its limitations, because the moment you take a policy and you make it profuse, you make it expansive, there will be flawed implementation. But it's a beautiful moment to combine the understanding of the impact of trauma, especially the impact of trauma.
Oh, Angel, I think you cut out again.
Can't implement trauma-informed practices and then see your children just as these traumatized kids who are showing up in your classroom. No, that's why this healing-centered engagement amplifies and stretches the conversation to ask teachers to think about what are the conditions, what are the practices that I can implement to allow my children to feel a sense of belonging, to allow my children to feel a sense of competence, to allow my children a sense of autonomy. Autonomy. Because what we know from decades of research is that if we continue to control our children and teach them to this test, to the standardized test, we're gonna stifle their actual learning process. So that the healing-centered turn is kind of incorporating social emotional learning, incorporating mindfulness, incorporating trauma-informed care, but more importantly, thinking about you. What are your triggers? What are the conversations that you avoid? What are the parts of you that, what is your shadow from a Jungian perspective? Like, have you integrated your shadow? Because for me, the reason why I can bring you this energy, the reason why I can be this forceful in the communities that I'm in is partly because I've done some work so that when I'm in these spaces, I don't get that inner critic saying, oh, Angel, you're not rigorous enough. Oh, Angel, you're not smart enough. Oh, Angel, you're an imposter in this space. Oh, no, those voices, because I've done enough work to be fully here, fully with you. So think about that. Being a teacher where your student sees you and just feels that you are so there. So that's what I'll say there, is that it really starts with you. We can go a little deeper, but so much scholarship in the scientific tradition is now looking how presence itself has so much power. Anybody else? would like to make a comment?
I do see one in the chat, Angel,
Yes.
From Sherry, asking, what does healing-centered engagement look like for a practitioner out in the community?
Yes, yes. And that's why I want to encourage everybody to sign up for the mailing list, because I'm actually in the process of taking all the research that I put together for my dissertation and putting it on there. But there's like, for example, there's this woman named Dr. Maria Mara Chavez from California. And her work was around healing-centered engagement. And several other scholars that were looking at people who were in the community in Oakland, in the community in the Bay, and were doing healing-centered engagement. So there's all kinds of beautiful ways in which people that were in the community doing housing activism, racial justice activism, and we're engaging in healing-centered justice. So that's not necessarily my work, but I know of people who are doing it. And I have the research of people who are doing it. And there, the work, again, one starts with self. And then two, there's this big shift now with the body, right? So somatic awareness, somatic experiences. Where does grief, trauma, pain show up in your body, right? Is it in your chest? Is it in your shoulders? Is it in your, and learning different somatic practices to move that work. So when we're doing social activism in the community, and then the community, you can see the pain from years of disinvestment. And then this happens with healthcare workers. They burn out. This notion of compassion fatigue is so real. So part of the healing-centered work from a community engagement perspective is being able to process the secondary trauma that comes from engaging in communities that have been historically disinvested in and traumatized. And then there's more. So please reach out, because I have those resources. Anybody else?
Just one more. I just unmuted. Go ahead.
Hi, my name is Jin Lim from University of Maryland. I taught a summer course, and in which one student focused on transgenerational trauma healing for African Americans, and she raised a lot of serious issues that African Americans suffer, such as like depression, chronic diseases, and then you mentioned that there's a physiological effect, right, that healing-centered education can have. And so she wants to explore, how healing-centered education can heal the traumas as we move forward, right, to build a just society. So can you say a little bit about that, like how healing-centered education can play a role in healing transgenerational traumas, and really like reviving the spirit of people who have been traumatized for generation to generations?
Yes, this is the most important question. This is the most exciting question for me. And I want to say a couple things. That right now, because of everything that's happening, all the multiple crises, I mean, we are in a difficult time right now. That it puts so much pressure on us to kind of move towards collective healing. So think about this. It costs $250 for me to get some time with a therapist, to allow me to talk through 33 years of trauma. And that therapist may not necessarily know my lived experience. So, and the accessibility around healthcare. So right now there's this movement, and scholars in the cultural trauma and cultural healing movement, like Thomas Hubel and others, are now saying that the next 20 years will move us into more collective healing processes. Collective, so in community, working with trauma and healing. And part of that healing and part of that trauma is transgenerational. And epigenetic research points to trauma being transmitted through generations. So we now have the genetic research that points to trauma being transmitted 4, 7, sometimes 14 generations into the future. So but the beautiful thing is that some evidence is out there that healing can happen in 1 generation. So it's a very exciting time. So for example, when I do the work of dealing with the abandonment issues that come from my mother and the ways in which that shows up in me, when I feel neglected, so that the notions of neglect, the notions of abandonment run in my family line. And when I disrupt that, when I work with that, you can actually create the conditions for my son, my daughter, when they engage me, for that material not to be transferred. Now, I'll end here. That intergenerational healing is amazing. It's beautiful. It's possible. But there is no, you can't do it without structural change, right? So like we can't all out here be meditating and in the world outside replicating the very same structures that produce the conditions for us to needing to meditate. You know, so like there's a real white national supremacist movement that's growing, right? There is a slow death that comes from historical disinvestment in these. So there's only so much intergenerational trauma I could do if I can't get a loan to buy that house in New Rochelle my wife and I want to get. So it's a combination and it's a nuanced conversation. I hope that was helpful. Let's talk to let's have C-Mind create a longer engagement that allows us to come together, and then we have, because for example, Sister Hazel's here, Dr. Lantier's here, you know, Dr. Hazel's here. We all here have something to say, and I actually want to create some space for Dr. Lantieri. Like, Dr. Lantieri, would you like to share anything?
Thank you, first of all, Angel, for your sharing. It's just very powerful of what you're holding for the research world right now, and in particular that you've integrated the contemplative practice into how you are looking at the research. I think that's the first I've seen anyway. And in this very practical way of seeing you with the labyrinth and all the other things that you might have done. But you've said so much today that has been important, and this last piece is really, really powerful, that we do have the potential in this moment right now to disrupt things that have been generation upon generation, but it does have to have collective healing along with it. And the circle is going to be the place where we do most of our healing in the next decade.
Yep.
Without a question.
Yep.
Without a question, right back to the indigenous ways of many of our ancestors sat around the circle and bore witness to each other. And so it's a powerful time. And the more we can bring in this healing-centered concept into what is happening, the more it's going to perhaps break us open.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. And I want to end by saying a couple of things. I can go on forever. So in Dr. Valerie Yanossik's book, Contemplative Qualitative Inquiry, she has a section where she uses the Buddhist Eightfold Path. And then she takes that model and creates a qualitative research model that allows you to use the Eightfold Path to do research. So really check that out. And then the last thing I'll say, because the most important thing, is being in right relationship with Mother Earth. That's really the being in right relationship with Mother Earth, because if we can't do that, then my great-great-great-grandchildren might not necessarily have a space to breathe. So with that being said, please check out the website with the mailing list. In the next month, I'm going to have a really robust resource list feel free to reach out to me individually, and join us for our breathwork session in August, and any other public offerings. Thank you so much. Thank you so much.